again to our program of looking at the scripture readings for this coming Sunday, which is the 14th Sunday of the year. And the first reading comes from the prophet Zechariah, chapter 9, a second reading from the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 8, and from the Gospel of Matthew, a section from chapter 11. What I'd like to do, first of all, today, is to continue looking at the Gospel of Matthew. Now, as you know, each week we listen to a section from Matthew's Gospel, although it is not consecutive in the sense that where it ended last week, we pick up again this week. Once in a while that happens, but in this occasion it does not. Last time, you remember, we looked at chapter 10 of Matthew's story, which was known as the missionary section. Chapter 11 brings us now to some sayings of Jesus, but it begins with a figure who is prominent in New Testament times, namely the figure of John the Baptist. John the Baptist is one of those men whose story in different ways appears in all four of the Gospels. And just as a little reminder, one of the things that sometimes is important to keep in mind, because what we're doing here with these little talks is to look at the scriptural text itself and trying to get a sense of where the original writer was hoping to develop his message about Jesus. And so one of the things that maybe is difficult to do, but which I might encourage you to do, is as we're listening to Matthew's story, forget that you know any information that comes from Mark, Luke, or John. Now that's hard to do because as a Christian tradition, over the centuries, we have tended to amalgamate certain things. But if, for example, one looked at the story of Matthew as if we didn't know any of the other three, what would he tell us about the figure of John the Baptist? Now, interestingly, and one of the other difficulties or one of the realities about John the Baptist is that often he is used in the Advent season. There are often 2 Sundays given over to some section from the gospel regarding the Baptist. And of course, this past year, which would have taken us back to the beginning of the church year there in Advent, there were 2 readings taken from Matthew's story with regard to the Baptist. So it isn't that this is the first time that we're hearing about the Baptist, but it's an interesting chapter in which it is pictured as John the Baptist is now in prison. So what had happened between the time that he had baptized Jesus in the Jordan and the ministry of Jesus that has begun, and there's a lot of fill-in-the-blanks that go on there, but John has been arrested. The reason for his being arrested is not clear in this gospel, and that's where one of those fill-in-the-blanks takes place. And as John is in, and this is the beginning now, what I want to do is kind of look at chapter 11 to lead up to the section that is this Sunday's reading, which comes to the end of chapter 11. So what has preceded it? Well, as the story of Matthew's Jesus continues, in chapter 11, we find that John is in prison. So the reason, as I mentioned, for his imprisonment, which we know from other reasons, but generally seems to have been that in a certain way he crossed Herod Antipas, who was the Jewish head of the region where John was. He had crossed him, and thus he found himself in prison. Now, while John is in prison, he sends word to Jesus or 2 of his disciples to ask Jesus if he really is the Messiah. Now see, here's again, keep in mind that many Hebrews were looking for a Messiah, and John had said that I'm not the Messiah, but I'm opening the door for the Messiah to come. But now in prison, and some have said, well, this is a foil, that John really knows the answer, much like lawyers are told, never ask questions that they don't know the answer to. Well, did John also know the answer? And he was just sending his disciples to kind of reaffirm their faith. Or was he really wondering whether or not Jesus was the promised Messiah? Why would that perhaps be a real question on his part? Because he, along with others who were looking for a Messiah, were expecting the Messiah, the Christ, to do certain things when he came. And looking around at what Jesus was doing, or listening around to what Jesus was saying, didn't seem to ring out with the pattern that John and others had in mind for a Messiah. So in that sense, the question that John is looking for from Jesus may very well have been legitimate, because somehow the behavior of Jesus was not matching the message that many hoped the Messiah would be. Now, Jesus, so therefore, now has to give a response to those messengers from John. Jesus doesn't give a direct answer. He says to these two men, go back to John and tell him what you hear and see that I'm doing, that the blind see, the lame walk, the good news is proclaimed to people. Send that message to John. And therefore they depart from the scene. So the opening of the chapter pictures John as being concerned as to whether or not all that he had been doing was really what he should have been doing and was worthwhile. As these messengers leave, Jesus now says to those who are assembled there, let me tell you something about the Baptist. Who is this Baptist? Well, we know, and many knew, that he was an ascetic, that he was fearless, that he was dedicated to the message of God. And Jesus now says, and this is the next part of this chapter, well, what did you go out to see? And if you went out to see someone who was dressed in fine clothes, well, they belong in the court or the homes of the rich, but that's not where you would find John. Well, what did you go out to see? A prophet. And Jesus says, yes, and more than a prophet. There is no one greater than John the Baptist in terms of a prophet than he. And then Jesus puts a little zinger. But one who believes in me is greater than the prophet, John. So, as some say, Jesus kind of puts a zinger. He builds up John. He points out that he is certainly a great preacher, a great teacher, but those who accept my word are even greater than he. Now, just as an aside, it perhaps is important to wonder why so much material, both in this gospel and to some degree in the other gospels, is given over to John the Baptist. And the answer may well be that the Baptist ministry extended over a considerable period of time, perhaps years. And so therefore he had gathered around him a series or a number of disciples who really thought that John was the man whom God would use to lead Israel back to its former glory. And when Jesus, and of course, as I've mentioned before, hindsight is also always a good help here. After Jesus' death and resurrection, we should not think that the disciples of John simply vanished, that all of those who had come to look at John as the promised one and who had not yet accepted Jesus or even thought that Jesus was a legitimate Messiah continued to carry on his work and his mission. And this would be true perhaps even down to the time when Matthew was writing his gospel. Some 50 years after Jesus' time, there still were disciples of John. So one of the kind of subtleties, I would suggest, of not only this gospel, but all of the gospels, was in a certain way to put John in his place. To say to John's disciples, look, it's Jesus who you should be looking to and following. John was good, but put him now into proper perspective. So that may explain why there was a great popularity of John the Baptist and why he is mentioned in all of the Gospels as having some relationship with Jesus. Now, in this Gospel, having praised the Baptist, he now says, you know, John and I share a common fate, namely, no one's going to listen to us. No one is going to accept what we say. And he now quotes a little section of children's games. Children used to have little games. One of them, maybe even today, kids do this imaginatively, was they imagined a wedding, and they did all the kind of things that kids do when they thought a wedding should be happening. It was a joyous occasion. Or on another occasion, they'd like to play funerals, and so of course that was a sad occasion. Now Jesus uses that image of children, and it's kind of interesting because children can sometimes be childish. Thank God none of us are that, but nevertheless. And so they decide to play a game, and the kids sit one on this side of the street and the other on the other side, and well, let's play funeral today. No, we don't want to do that. Well, let's play wedding today. No, we don't want to do that. And then he makes the contrast. When John came, he came as I mentioned, as an ascetic. He fasted. He led the life of a prophet. When Jesus came, he was more joyful. He ate, he would kind of fit the wedding bit. He ate with others. He was happy. And when people listened to both the message of Jesus and John, they canceled them both out. John was too heavy, too sorrowful. Jesus, he was a glutton. He ate and drank with all of those. And so what Jesus is saying, nobody paid any attention, or they chose not to accept either the message of the Baptist or the message of Jesus. So that's all material that's leading up to this week. Then Jesus is pictured as saying to certain cities, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum or Capernaum. Now, I'm sure you know where those all are, but if you had a little map of Jesus' time, you would see they were all cities up in the region we call the Galilee. Now, actually, all three of those are archaeological sites, although there has been Capernaum, which was generally recognized as the center of Jesus' operations in the Galilee, has been restored somewhat in our day. There is a synagogue that was believed to be used in the 2nd and 3rd century, and there is now a building over the place which many believe was Peter's house in Capernaum. But as far as Chorazin and Bethsaida, they are archaeological sites, but not much is happening there right now. But the point that Jesus is saying in this gospel is, if they only had accepted the message of the gospel. See, so sometimes we go after persons. This little section goes after places or the cities. And if the message had come from Tyre and Sidon, they would have welcomed it. Now, where's Tyre and Sidon? Just to the north of the Galilee. So if you have a map there, you'll see. And it was technically a non-Jewish territory. And Jesus' message is, you see, if they had got it, they would have accepted it. But the people who should have gotten it kind of rejected it. So all of this is prologue to the section of the gospel that we hear today. Now, as I mentioned last week, the leadership of Judaism at the time of Matthew were the scribes and the Pharisees. And often Jesus is pictured as aiming his message at them. They are supposedly the intellectuals. They are supposedly the ones who importantly interpret the Torah or the law. And Jesus will now say, and what I would like to look at, the section of the gospel, as I mentioned, that is presented to us now, are verses 25 through 30. That brings us to the end of chapter 11. So all of this has been so far a kind of prologue leading up to this, where Jesus is now pictured as saying, well, to whom is he saying this? Who are those negatives who have unfortunately not really kept the message alive as they should have? So there are three sayings now that are brought to our attention. You can check this out if you have a little Bible at home. Verses 25 and 26 is a prayer, a public confession of praise and thanks to God. And again, this is very important to remember that Jesus prays the way in which he was taught. After all, he was raised in a Jewish family. His sense of prayer therefore followed that pattern. And always good prayer to God begins by praising God. So if you look at these two verses, it is what we would call a public confession of praise and thanks to God. Then in verse 27, which is a very interesting section, perhaps found only in Matthew's story, is a declaration of a very special relationship that Jesus has with the Father. I do the Father's will wish. Now this is the closest. You find some of this kind of thinking in John's Gospel, but this is the closest that you come to this way of thinking in what we would call the synoptic tradition, where Jesus speaks of this very special relationship that he has, as I mentioned, with the Father. And then in verses 28 through 30 is an invitation to those who are outside the circle of the disciples to share in the wisdom teaching of Jesus. Now, this is interesting because Matthew sees Jesus, we'll perhaps have not discussed this as much, but sees Jesus as a great wisdom teacher. Wisdom. Now, you have to go back to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament to get some understanding of this role of wisdom. Wisdom is portrayed, interestingly, as a female person who was with God, who knew what God was doing, who watched what God was doing. And so the question, and later on, the Gospel of John, of course, picks up this and turns wisdom from a she to a he, so that it applies nicely to Jesus and calls Jesus the Word. Now, that's not what Matthew does. But what is wisdom? And where is it to be found? Well, there are different ways. Wisdom could be found in the law of the Most High. So therefore, if one went to the Old Testament, there would find wisdom as the Torah, the law. Or in a book that is frequently used nowadays. It's called an intertestamental book, the book of Enoch, Enoch, has a number of sayings that reflect different teachings of Jesus. Interestingly, although it was not a New Testament work, speaks of wisdom as heavenly mysteries. And then, of course, Paul, in one of his letters, speaks of wisdom as Jesus, as Christ. And one would then, well, where is wisdom to be found? Well, in Jesus' world, wisdom was to be found in the temple in Jerusalem. That's where true wisdom resided. Others would say, well, it's all over. All you have to do is look around and there you would find wisdom. Or was wisdom in the heavens and it came down? Or was wisdom in the church? So all of this is kind of background to say Jesus here is pictured as divine. And it's the one place really in the synoptics where this idea comes across. Finally, just to finish this up, because I want to spend a little time with the first reading today, Jesus utters words here that almost every one of you, when we grew up, if you were my age, knew by heart. Learn of me, for I am meek and humble of heart, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So if Catholics could quote certain, maybe they knew 4 or 5 quotes they could give at the drop of a nickel or a dime, whatever the penny you had, it would be this: my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, everyone, of course, knows what the yoke is. Simply was used in agricultural work to link together 2 animals, the idea being that together they had more strength and more determination. Well, how is Jesus' yoke different than whom? Than the yoke of the intellectuals, the leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees. There we are, back again. And so this is kind of a little push against them. For my yoke is not like theirs. My yoke is one that is easy, and know that I am with you always. This again is one of the overriding themes, or underwriting themes if you want, of Matthew's gospel. I am with you all days. The gospel will end by saying. Well, Jesus here is saying that he indeed is with his disciples. So I'm sure you'll hear some wonderful words about this little section of Matthew's story. But I did want to kind of give the background as we led up to it. I want to say a few things about the opening reading, which of course is chosen, as I've mentioned before, to somewhat match some idea that is found in the gospel. Zechariah was one of the last prophets to be mentioned in the Old Testament. And so therefore his period of time would have been at what we would know, as you may know, we divide the prophets of the Old Testament into 3 categories: pre-exilic, exilic, and post-exilic. Because the most significant event in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible world was the experience known as the exile. It took place between the years 570 to 530 before the common time. Now, the prophet Zechariah, and I mentioned him because you will hear the same section this Sunday that you would have heard on Palm Sunday for the entrance of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. And the story is that the messenger of God will come riding on, now, depending on your translation of the Bible, if you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, you call it a donkey, or more familiarly was known as an ass. Well, Be that as it may, it pictures that Israel's great Savior will enter riding on this kind of an animal rather than a horse. What's the difference? Well, horses, of course, when you think of it, tended to a person sitting on a horse tower over you, exemplify power, rule, and even in battle, you remember that there would be the leaders who would ride horses and the infantry who would walk and kind of be up front for the battle. But if you come on an animal whose task was basically something that had to do with life, a farm animal. And Jesus is, and of course, we apply this to Jesus. Now, often keep in mind that I don't think that Zechariah was thinking of Jesus. You see, later tradition says, oh, this, and Matthew is very good at this. We have not talked a lot about this. We will as we go along. Matthew is very good at looking into the past, into the Hebrew Bible, to see if he can't find something that would help appreciate an understanding of Jesus. So we call these prophecies. Matthew, he kind of helps create passages that enrich our understanding of Jesus. And so in Zechariah's time, this Messiah, he hoped would come in his time, would bring help and assistance to the poor, to the needy. This is a consistent theme throughout the Old Testament and throughout the Bible in general. And he hoped, Zechariah did, that there would be a restoration of the house of David, who of course was the great model of kings, and the kind of glory that tradition said had belonged to David's son, Solomon. So Zechariah had, if we think about it, a little different view of what the Messianic age would be like. But Matthew sees one quite importantly connected with Jesus. So for that reason, this section from Matthew's, or from Zechariah's story is included in Matthew's, because this Jesus, and now you can see how this matches some of the things we've mentioned earlier on today, matches the understanding of Jesus' role. He certainly would be one who would rule this is Jesus, in righteousness and justice. He certainly will save, with God's help, those who are in need. And he will be gentle. Now, the word humble is sometimes used. He will be gentle of heart or humble of heart. The problem with the word humble, as you know sometimes, is that people connect it with someone who is weak. You know, kind of the Uriah Heep of Dickens' story there, who, oh yes, whatever you want, don't worry, you can walk all over me kind of person. That wasn't really what humility was. Humility was, and even the word itself means of the earth. One understood who one was and understood one's right relationship with others. And so in that sense, gentleness is not weakness. Gentleness is really strength. And therefore Jesus is saying, my yoke is gentle, whereas those of the others are still looking for the wrong kind of thing, who still think that the way to make things better is through force and power, who perhaps still agree with Zechariah's viewpoint. But my viewpoint, says Jesus, as Matthew remembers him, is different. It will be real, and it will be not always accepted, and that puts this whole chapter 11 now, again, that we've looked at today, of Matthew's story into perspective. Jesus' message will entail difficulty for those who seek to follow it, but it is important. It will have its day, and it will continue to bring to others those helps and needs that they are. In closing, let me just remind us that Jesus' Messiahship is going to be opposed to all sense or all kinds of violence. If the horse and somehow is connected with the powerful who bring violence, the donkey is connected with ordinary life, but who brings, think about what does the donkey's work bring? Help, health. After all, what was he doing in the fields? Plowing it so that you could grow things. What's the horse doing in the field? Just running around, getting ready to be used for whatever it was. So there's an interesting play here on animals, even in this little section of the gospel. So, Jesus, I am meek and humble of heart, my yoke is easy and my burden light. Doesn't mean with a burden light that it's necessarily not there. You know, if you want to think light, it's easier to carry 5 pounds of sugar than 50 pounds of sugar. So Jesus is saying in that sense, it might be, I'm not sure that's a good illusion, but nevertheless, one that might work. So thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.